Hello. In this chapter, chapter 6, we will be looking at railroads. And after reading this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Appreciate the contributions of the railroad industry to the development of the U.S. economy, gain an understanding of the size and types of firms in the railroad industry, discuss the relevance of the intermodal and intramodal competition in the railroad industry, know major types of commodities hauled by railroads, and recognize the different types of equipment used in the railroad industry. Discuss the nature of costs in the railroad industry and how they impact pricing decisions, and understand the importance of intermodal car loadings on the growth of the railroad industry, and be aware of the current issues facing the railroad industry today. As we look at the brief history of the rail industry, we've got to see that there's offering of scheduled common carrier freight and passenger service to the public that began in the U.S. all the way back in 1830, with the start of operations on 13 miles of road between Baltimore and Ellicott Mills, Maryland. When the Civil War started and it began in 1860, 30,626 miles of road were in service. But by then, the rail transportation had proven overwhelmingly superior in both price and service quality to animal-powered road transportation, and superior in service to quality to water transportation on lakes, rivers, and canals, and on the ocean between different ports within the U.S. When it was in existence on the first 30 years, the railroad industry evolved from a population of unconnected carriers focused on shore haul traffic to the completion of longer distance lines that were located largely between the Atlantic seaboard on the east, the Mississippi River on the west, and the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes on the north, and the Potomac and Ohio rivers in the south. The Civil War slowed down a bit, but it did not stop rail construction during the 1960s. But there was a completion in 1869 of the first rail link that marked the beginning of the greatest boom in American history for the railroad mileage. And by the year 1900, total mileage stood at 196,345, accessing all parts of the country and providing shippers and travelers with a national network of carriers that connected with one another. And so the first part of the chapter is giving you just a brief overview of the history of the rails and how things have changed from the 1800s till now. So as of 2006, the railroads have shipped over 43% of all ton miles moved by all transport modes in the U.S. And that percentage of tons miles has been declining since its peak of 75% back in 1929. But the actual tons miles have, for the most part, been steadily increasing. In the year of 1980, a total of 932 billion tons of miles of domestic intercity freight was moved. That figure dropped to 810 billion ton miles in 82, due mostly to the recession of 1982 to 1983. So these figures highlight the fact that even though railroads continue to move record amounts of goods, they're capturing less of the total transportation market because other modes have been growing even faster. And so as we look at that brief history, we're going to look at the industry overview. So the first point that we want to look at is the number of carriers. There were 565 railroads that were listed in 2007, and there were only 7 Class 1 companies. That's Table 6.1 in your book for Chapter 6, and this meant that each did more than $359.6 million annually in revenue. Those are 2007 numbers, or a total of $52.9 billion. And so the balance of railroads is classified as regional or local, but they account for almost $4 billion in revenue. So road mileage expanded rapidly during the initial construction of 1830 to 1910 and reaching its peak of 254,251 miles in 1916. So as we look at that, we're also going to look at the competition. So during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the industry is faced with intense intermodal competition and selective intramodal competition. And the railroads have to compete with that. Again, think back to last chapter, chapter 5, with the motor carriers. We got intramodal and intermodal. Those are two terms that impact the railroad industry's economic structure. So there's only a few railroads that serve a particular geographic region there, but there's oligopolistic market structure because there's a small number of interdependent large sellers. So barriers in entry into the rail car company market exist because of large capital outlays and fixed costs required, and consequently pricing can be controlled by existing firms. So that's kind of a stark contrast to entry into the motor carrier. Intermodal is the relative market share of railroad intercity ton miles, and it's been steadily declining because of increased intermodal competition. So the inroads into the lucrative commodity markets have been facilitated by governmental expenditures on infrastructure that's benefited competing modes. So we think about that. Again, the railroads, overall retrospect, they have been rate competitive, but with the government influence, either in the form of economic regulation or expenditure programs is aimed at promoting other modes together with the intermodal competition. It's forced the railways into making a determined effort to forestall industry decline by becoming more competitive. We're going to look at mergers too in the railroad industry, and the recent trend has been like a side-by-side combination as well as end-to-end mergers. And customer service and reliability can be improved by these mergers. And there's been 28 mergers that have been taking place over the last 30 years. And Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, CSX Transportation, Burlington North Santa Fe, there's like only 4 major rail lines, and those were just mentioned. Also, abandonments is another issue. There's abandonment of track around the country. How many times have you rode around in small towns, even bigger towns, and there's railroad tracks that haven't been used in many, many years, but they're still there. So when we had the interstate came into use, the interstate highway system, that did impact railroad travel immensely, hauling materials and freight. So it helped motor carrier services, though the highway system did, to decrease transit time by shifting the freight from rail to motor. And so when you had deregulation thrown into the mix, that occurred back in the 80s, it gave companies freedom to buy, sell, or abandon unprofitable track without federal interference. So that land was used for rights of way, could also be used unless the original deed required them to return when the property was no longer being utilized. So sometimes those abandonments were in like rural branches or difficult lines left over from the mergers. And so the STB does regulate amendments, but it changes the law, made it much easier for the railroad industry to close unprofitable lines. And now we're going to look into the operating and service characteristics, or general service characteristics of the railroads. So the commodities hauled, coal, farm products, chemicals, transportation equipment, those are the most common and have been part of that service for many, many years, and still as today. Then we look at traffic shifts and constraints. So when you look at the demand for freight transportation, it's a derived demand, and economic conditions have an impact upon the demand for transportation service. So when you look at intermodal movements by rail, it's increased by 6.9% during the economic downturn in 2003. And then this trend towards intermodal moves could prove to be very beneficial to the railroad industry. So things have turned a corner a bit for the railroad industry at that time. But there's also constraints because there's those fixed right of ways and there's different degrees of service completeness. So the shipper and receiver possess rail sidings, door-to-door service can be provided, but either or both do not have to have the sidings, but the movement of the goods must be completed by some other mode. And there's on-time delivery performance issues, but the frequency of service is deteriorated in the past. Improvements have been made in recent years. We look at the strengths, though, of the railroad industry, and it's a large carrying capacity is an advantage. And also, motor carriers, in contrast, are constrained by volume and weight to the smaller truckload and less than truckload markets. And we also have to think about the liability for loss and damage is usually assumed by the railroads. Damage occurs because rail freight often goes through a rough trip due to vibrations and shocks, steel wheel and steel rail. So think about that. Another area of attention that's received much examination has been the intermodal area, is namely the trailer on flat car, the TOFC, and the container on flat car, the COFC service. And the railroads realize that the necessity of proving the TOFC and the COFC service is effectively with motor carriers. It gives them good competition. When we think about equipment in the railroad industry, you got carload, and that's a basic unit of measurement of freight handling, and a carload can vary in size and capacity. Then we're going to look at service innovations, especially in concern of TOFC, and CFOC. And the railroad cost structure does make it necessary to attract large and regular volumes of traffic to take advantage of scale economies and operate efficiently. Then we got the fixed cost, the cost structure of railroad. And we got to look at the fixed cost structure. It's in the short run. It's a period when both plant and capacity remain constant and contains a large proportion of indirect fixed cost rather than variable cost. And then you got semi-variable cost, and that's maintenance for rights of way. So structures and equipment have accounted for more than 40% of railroad outlays in recent years. You've got your variable cost, and those are a large proportion of every revenue dollar, with labor being the largest single element of the variable cost. And then as we look more about labor, the cost of labor as of 2007 was $14.4 billion. And again, the train maintenance and engine employees accounting for about 78% of all the wages paid by the railroads. But the railroad industry over the years has been reducing the size of the standard train crew whenever possible, and the dual basis for the pay for a full day's work is inefficient in today's operating environment. And then you've got fuel economies of scale, the financial plights of the railroads because of government funding. Um, they did help the rail competitors with the rights of way, but without fully charging them for the cost of constructing or maintaining them, as with the rail industry. Then we got legislation reform, the Rail Passenger Act of 1970. You need to read over that. What that did was it created the government-sponsored National Railroad Passenger Corporation, Amtrak, which relieved the railroads of the requirement to provide necessary passenger operations that were not profitable. Then you got the Regional Rail Act of 1973 and also the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act of 76, and then the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. And it replaced the regulatory structure that existed since the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, and that created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. But the ICC Termination Act of 95 eliminated the ICC and transferred economic rail regulations to the Surface Transportation Board, STB, that I mentioned earlier in the lecture. And there's also current issues. There's alcohol and drug abuse among those that work in the railroad industry. And there's employee assistance programs that are called EAPs that enable those troubled employees to be rehabilitated because that is a very serious concern. Energy shortages in the 70s also made the U.S. increasingly aware of the need to conserve natural resources. And the USDOT did a study that concluded that railroads are more energy efficient than motor carriers, even when measured in terms of consumption per ton mile. We also look at the technology and how it affects the railroad industry, and also the future. We got to look at the advanced train control systems. That's ATCS, joint venture between U.S. and Canada. It uses computers to visually track the flow of trains. There's rail yard control, communications and signaling, customer service, and also RFID, radio frequency identification tags. Now also track equipment and shipments in the rail industry. And then the future role of smaller railroads is there's consolidation among Class 1 railroads that has led to the increase in number of regional and small rail carriers. And the small and regional carriers often have to operate at a cost disadvantage, but have some advantages given they were more flexible and adaptable in meeting the needs of their customers or their shippers. When we look at customer service for the Class 1 railroads, and some are perceived by shippers as not being customer focused, but it's grown in intercity transport during the 90s as mergers continue to occur. And then the drayage for intermodal service, that's one constraint of a rail service is the fixed nature of the rail route and a high cost to add rail segments. But as we look at the pickup and delivery of trailers and containers in conjunction with the small line rail movement, it's usually referred to as local drayage. So those are some concepts that you need to look at as you study more about railroads and why they're still a very important mode of transportation in this day and time.